Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frankie Flores, pronouns they and Asia. I am the director of the UNM LGBTQ Resource Center. I am so glad you all are here with us. I'm super excited to share some preliminary research on queering UNM's history. I think what has been the most exciting for me and the most fulfilling for me is that uncovering that history, which also then leads to what else is there, right? What are the other questions that we should be asking? So I'm excited for us to have this hour together. Um, I am a big fan of asking questions as they come up. So as questions come up, please put them in the chat. Um, we are also streaming on Facebook. So our Facebook will be monitored as well. And those questions will be fed to me also. All right, so we are going to begin with our land acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. So I want to begin with a bigger picture of what queer activism looked like in the mid-20th century in the United States. For those of y'all who were in attendance last week, our grad student Pico Villa did some amazing work on really diving into the heart of queer activism, Compton's cafeteria riots, and Stonewall. So I will just be doing a brief overview. So Compton cafeteria riots were 3 years prior to Stonewall. They were done in 1966 in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. It was predominantly BIPOC sex workers who were there. Some of the names they used for themselves were hair fairies, drag queens, transsexuals. And what started this is there was a raid by police at Compton's cafeteria, which is where a lot of these individuals would hang out at. You could go there for a cup of coffee and it was super cheap. And it was a protest against police brutality. And I think that that's an important remembrance for us to have when we talk about queer activism, is that our queer activism has been rooted in protesting institutional brutality. And so one of the individuals who was there, who recently passed, may she rest in power, Felicia Flames, has gone into depth about what that situation was like. If you have not seen it, I highly recommend the film Screaming Queens, which is available on Amazon Prime for free. It is an amazing documentary, and we hear direct experiences from individuals who were at that action. So 3 years forward, in June 28th, 1969, Stonewall riots happened in New York City. It was really led by butch, femme, trans individuals, drag queens, and again, it was a protest against police brutality. And it was also intersectional protesting. You know, it was starting out of queer injustice, but also Black Panthers were there. The Puerto Rican Teachers Association was there. It was intersectional because individuals knew that if they're coming for one of us, they're going to come for all of us. And so some of the major players that were there were Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Storm de la Rie, Miss Major, and Jay Toole. I have had the immense pleasure of meeting Miss Major and Jay Toole, who are phenomenal individuals. So we are going to move directly, we're going to actually move into the late 40s, early 1950s. So Ben Duncan was a UNM student who wrote a book called The Same Language. So his book offers a unique glimpse into the life of a gay man, not only in the late 40s and early 50s, but also a look at a gay man's life at UNM during this time. Ben grew up in the South, and he was often moving around as his father tried to navigate a better job for himself. Ben was orphaned as a teen and was sent to live in a foster home. During his time in a foster home, he was able to navigate sexual experiences with other young men. He didn't specifically call them gay experiences. He just called them sexual experiences, and he found them to be very satisfying for himself. After high school, he enlisted in the army, where he also found other men who experienced the same desires as him. He does not reference this behavior as homosexual, but rather focuses only on the physical aspects of these encounters. So I also want to note that the language that I use will be reflecting Ben's writing and may not be the most current language that we use, but I think is indicative of the time. So after his time in the army, he applied for numerous schools in the United States. Again, people who were in the army were able to go to university for free. And he was really hoping to be at Vanderbilt or another prestigious university in the South, but his sergeant actually encouraged him to apply to the University of New Mexico. And he began his career at UNM in 1947. So his arrival in Albuquerque bears similarities to a lot of other accounts of white folks coming into New Mexico and exoticizing indigenous peoples and marveling at the navigation of Mexican and Spanish identities. In particular, he found the notion of someone being Mexican in New Mexico very interesting because he assumed that Mexican meant of Spanish descent, and didn't really think about the intersectionalities of Mexican identities. He was actually really fearful of coming to New Mexico and its Catholicism because he was afraid that UNM would not accept and would embrace who he was. In his early formation of community, he found camaraderie with artists, with bohemians, people identified as socialists, and there was conversation of what he called homos amongst the group, but they were mainly in a realm of homos are writers, they are artists, they aren't necessarily real people. Um, and as homosexuality was understood as something that was naturally occurring um, in for individuals, but it was not something that was really discussed because it didn't really fit into this heteronormative ideal of socialist home and family. And so Ben really felt out of place even amongst this group. But he did find some individuals where he developed close relationships with. It's also important to note at this time that a lot of the relationships he did foster were surrounded by drinking, and so he was an English student, and one of his colleagues, Jay, was in a lot of his classes. They had a lot of classes together, and they formed a very close relationship. They eventually moved in together, and the relationship became kind of blurred. Ben describes it as him being the homemaker. He would do things like he would do Jay's laundry, he would make Jay's bed, and he felt like Jay's wife. They also had these really long conversations about poetry and art, and they had this idea that after graduation that they would both moved together to Paris to have this bohemian life. One night they were at a party, and Jay and Ben had drank too much, and they had to stay the night at this house because they had missed the city bus. The two of them had to share a bed, and Ben decided to make his move and put his arms around Jay. Uh, Jay did not respond negatively nor positively. Jay just kind of let it happen, didn't say anything about it. This left Ben really confused, but also excited because he thought that this was the formation of a bigger relationship. Um, but following this night, there was a shift in their dynamic. Jay stopped speaking of his plans of living together in Paris and leading a bohemian lifestyle. Jay really reinforced that after college, they were both going to find wives, have children, the white picket fence. They were going to lead very normal lives. When Jay graduated, Ben was left devastated. Ben was brokenhearted and turned to really heavy drinking at this time. He sort of moved away from his original group of friends that he had, and he found a new group that was part of the drama department. And so in this drama group, he met a student who resembled Jay and began an affair with him. Ben admittedly felt nothing for him, going so far as saying that this person could have well been a rubber doll. Um, and I find it very interesting that Ben does not name this individual in his writing, kind of reinforcing that this person wasn't really seen so much as a person, just as an object. Ben was drinking heavily. Ben was living um, a sort of reckless life, and he met a student who was older than him, whose name was Jack Maine. Jack intervened in Ben's life one day, telling him, and we see the quote here on the presentation: "I've been observing you. I think you don't know what you are, or you don't want to. I'm going to tell you what I am, and then we'll take it from there." Jack then began recounting a story of his experience in the army. He had met a Russian soldier, and they actually had a 2-year long relationship together. They had a house together. They lived in um, a very heteronormative relationship. And for 2 years, they had this blissful relationship. Um, when Jay when Jack rather was relocated, um, the relationship between the two ended. They talked occasionally, or they mailed each other occasionally, but eventually Jack's partner sent him a picture of him and his wife and their child, and then he never heard from them again. Um, but what was the big takeaway from this is that Ben started to realize that gay people could have meaningful relationships, that it wasn't just about sexual encounter, that your emotions, your attractions were far more nuanced than that. And again, it's fascinating to think that this conversation was being had in the 1950s. um, Jack also introduced Ben to the word gay, and telling him this was a term that had came out of New York theater language. And Jack told him that there were going to be numerous words that were going to be used for people like them, but none of them mattered except this one. He told them that people would try to use religion and psychology to explain away their existences, but there was nothing unnatural about who they were and how they felt. Um, and this proved to be really formative for Ben's life. You know, Jack then, and this is the part I find the most fascinating. Jack went on to tell Ben that there were numerous gay people at UNM. Two professors that Ben had done typing for were known lesbians. Ben was stunned to hear this, and he considered these professors to be highly intelligent and capable, and really kind of dispelled that myth that he had that trans and queer folks in the 1950s, a lot of them had, that you could not be successful and homosexual. And so Jack also went on to say that there were a lot of other students and faculty, some of which were married, who were gay as well. And so I think that this actually brings up a really interesting question. One, how did Jack know that these individuals were queer as well? In the 1950s, there were two known queer bars in Albuquerque, one being Duke's Cave on Central and 7th, and the other being the Heights Cocktail Lounge, which I actually have not been able to find exactly where that one was. For those of you who are a little unfamiliar with Albuquerque history, there's a location, of establishment rather, on Central called the El Rey Theater. And right next to it, there used to be some steps that went down, and you'd go down those steps, and that was Duke's Cave, and that was a known homosexual establishment. So were they meeting in these spaces, or it kind of feels like there was a larger network and networking that happened on UNM campus that a lot of people weren't talking about. Also, I think it is interesting to note that, the university campus, there weren't, it wasn't a huge campus at the time, right? And so for Jack to say that there were many individuals on campus like them, and Ben was able, or Jack was able to name them off, really does suggest that it was a really large, thriving community. And we'll see later on that some of that actually there is some credits to that. So Jack graduated, moved away, told Ben to do great things with his life, and Ben applied for a Henry Fallows to study in Oxford, England, which he did receive. And he moved to England in hopes to find a bigger gay community. Ben stayed in England for the rest of his life. He found a partner there, and he created that relationship and that bond that he had been looking for his entire life. And I actually find this to be this account to be both really revealing and limiting in its scope. Ben does mention in his prologue that he had to, when it was it was eventually republished in the early 2000s, and in his forward in it, he did mention that he had to straight wash a lot of the language in its first release because it would not have been published if there was mention of homosexuality. When he did republish it, he did add in some more, but also this is about 40 years after the events in 1950. So a lot of his recollections were lost, names were lost, and also he doesn't explicitly say this, but it is assumed that names of the individuals he was engaging with were changed at UNM. I really do want to do some more research in this, but it does bring up a dilemma, right? I could probably dig into the faculty records and I could figure out who these professors were, but is that helpful? And is that harmful to those professors and their families? We don't know how out they were at the time or if they ever came out. And so, this is always kind of the danger of doing any sort of queer research is, in uncovering queer history, there always runs the risk of outing someone and creating a new narrative of a memory for that person. Are there any thoughts, questions so far? All right. So we're going to move on to the 1960s and 70s, and we're going to talk about two really fascinating cases of queerness in UNM's history. So in 1970, an individual by the name of Sam Taggart was crowned homecoming queen. He ran as homecoming queen and he won. And also in 1975, there was an individual who's named PM Duffy and Gracia, who actually one of our LGBTQ advisory board members had a new PM, and we actually have plans on meeting and doing and sharing some stories because I have some thoughts on how I want to honor actually PM through the Resource Center. But PM ran as a known lesbian. She was self-identified. She said, it's all tits and ass. I never ran on a platform of being gay, but instead because it's sexist and oppressive to women. All they see is a sexy looking body. And what's fascinating is that PM, when she received, when she was crowned in a pantsuit, which people were shocked by, horrified by. And so we're going to move on to the love-lust controversy. So for those of you who don't know, this is a really interesting and intersectional portion of UNM history. So in the late 60s, Black TA Lionel Williams in an English class shared the poem Love Lust with students, and it was considered obscene by UNM's leadership in the state legislature. Prior to Lionel sharing this with the class, Lionel had told students, we are going to talk about things that maybe are potentially uncomfortable. If you want to leave class, if you want to transfer into another section, feel free to do so. I will help you, but just know that we are going to be tackling controversial subjects. Some students didn't leave the class, but a lot of students were okay actually with the poem being read. The reason it became a huge issue for UNM leadership is because a daughter that was in the class told UNM, her father, who worked for UNM, that this obscene poem was being read. Funding from the state was threatened to be cut if Lionel was not fired. Part of the issue also was that prior to the Love Lust poem, Williams had invited Kenneth Pollock to his class to give a lecture on homosexuality. Both Pollock and Williams were actually fired, and a conversation about decency began across New Mexico. Over 1,000 students and faculty protested the conservative views of the university and its president and staged a 24-hour teach-in in the Student Union building. It is really important to note that this really raised the issue of anti-Blackness on this campus. The Black Student Union remarked that other professors had taught the same author in the same poem and nothing had come of it. It is also really important to highlight that Lionel Williams was married to a white woman at the time and received tons of hate mail detailing how people were going to castrate him. The controversy eventually did die down, but out of this, there grew a conversation of a need for feminist spaces and for specifically gay liberation spaces. And this was actually the founding of the Gay Liberation New Mexico, which was a student group founded at UNM in 1969. And if you have a moment, I highly recommend reading up on the Love Lust controversy. It is fascinating, and it's also just really kind of terrifying of how anti-Black UNM and the history of anti-Blackness at UNM. So in 1972, the Women's Studies, earlier than 1972, but the Women's Studies program is one of the oldest in the United States. In the winter of 1970, graduate students and staff taught a class titled The Second Sex, Exploration and the Revolution of Women from Economic, Political, and Historical Points of View. And in 1974, the Women's Studies program hired 2 known lesbians from a local women's group that was called Siren to teach lesbianism in America. This class was taught in the fall, and it was the most attended class with 75 students and community members in attendance. And I have here a Daily Lobo article from, and it was a dean who was really pushing back on these classes and was saying that some of these classes were not approved, and he was really bothered by this controversial lesbian feminism class. And also teaching things on, like teaching classes such as Women in Law, American Women Writers, and teaching Introduction to Women's Studies. So throughout the 70s and 80s, there were articles that were done in the Daily Lobo on queer life in New Mexico, or in New Mexico and at UNM. So the New Mexico Gay Liberation, they changed their name to Juniper, which was a community service organization, and they were a student group, and there was a huge controversy with them because funding was cut from them because it was felt like it did not align with UNM's policies and UNM's morals and ethics. So this group, Juniper, was trying to get funding for counseling services and to have a space of their own. And they were shot down by ASUNM Senate. They were told that if people needed counseling, they should just go to Agora. And senators and students fought back against this and said there are different issues that LGBTQ, well, gay and lesbian individuals face that Agora nor the Rape Crisis Center are prepared to handle. And this also became a really big controversy. The ACLU was brought in to argue this and to discuss it. There was, um, there was tons of Senate meetings. Funding was actually removed from them, and it really just sparked again a huge conversation around LGBTQ individuals on campus in the mid 1970s. Um, PM Duffy was an ASUNM senator as well and fought very hard to get funding for Juniper. And there actually was eventually a resolution passed by ASUNM Senate. So there was this, so a couple of op-ed articles that were in the Daily Lobo um, were individuals who, so PM did write one, and it was thanking the ASUNM Finance Committee for eventually the funding of Juniper. Um, and it was a student chartered organization, which I think is just phenomenal to think about. Um, it took us 40 years to get an LGBTQ resource center. And I think what's important to highlight is that work was being done in the 1960s. And also there was individuals who, of course, were really opposed to Juniper and funding it. This individual, H.W.M. Hart, um, feared that there was going to be a class in bestialism, that there was going to be a class in drag queen makeup. Um, and there was this fear, right, that UNM was going to become a queer campus. So in the 1980s, more articles were published in Daily Lobo about what it meant to be a gay person at UNM. And so a couple of individuals were interviewed talking about their experience. Juniper had gone through another name change, and they were the Gay and Lesbian Student Union. Um, and the Gay and Lesbian Student Union met in the sub. They had talks about their experiences. They also brought in individuals to teach self-defense. They brought in individuals to talk about the coming out process. Um, and some individuals had really great experiences here. Some people had really hard experiences here. And some people really found that UNM had changed a lot. There was an evolution of queerness at UNM. So what I found interesting also is that they really started having conversations around the detrimental effects of AIDS amongst gay men. And there were conversations around sexual health that were starting in the early 1980s and continued on. So here's an article from 1985, and when it's the first article where they mention AIDS, actually. Um, and they talk about the fear of it, and they talk about high rates of alcoholism and suicide. And so they do talk about working with Agora, working with the Rape Crisis Center, but really they also found that there was a specific need for LGBTQ specific spaces. And there were other organizations such as the Rainbow Coalition and the United Way that offered help for individuals who were experiencing HIV and AIDS, but there was also a need to do activism on their own. And so that actually ended up becoming a much bigger organization. So in 1992, um, the the United Court of Sandias, now known as the Imperial Sovereign Court of New Mexico, was founded. And this organization was founded because they were fundraising for people to have funeral services. For a very long time, funeral homes would not cremate nor bury LGBTQ individuals or individuals that died from AIDS, because there was this fear that it was going to seep into the ground. Um, and so, and parents also, families wouldn't claim gay men who were dying of HIV and AIDS. So the the United Court of Sandias founded, and their home bar at the time was Fox's. And for those of y'all who are younger or weren't in Albuquerque, Fox's was a dive. It was dingy, and it was also a super fascinating space, though. And it was a place, it was a community center, really. And the first empress of the United Court of Sandias, Empress Helga, seen here, um, was a bearded queen and was really kind of pushing against gender norms. And so, what we do see at UNM, though, is we do see a severe lack of articles or research being done on queerness in UNM from about 1991 up until 2005. And so in 2009, conversations about about needing an LGBTQ resource center began. And so we were founded actually by Dr. Josephine de Leon, pictured here in the middle, and a couple of students, three of them being Jeffrey Waldo, Adam Quintero, and David Griffith. They went to Dr. de Leon, who was brand new VP of the newly formed Division for Equity and Inclusion, and asked her to do this to help create this space. And I think it was a really dangerous move for her. And it was a risky move to advocate for this. She was so new on campus. But through her work and dedication, she was able to secure funding for the LGBTQ Resource Center. We were funded as a one-year program in the basement of a building that was right behind Dane Smith Hall. It was originally one room for staff to work in, and then a computer pod. And at one point, we had 9 staff members working in an office that was maybe, I don't know, 10 by 12. It was really small. And the way that we actually advocated for more spaces, we took pictures of everybody working in the room, because at times there were all of 9 of us in the room, and we sent it to Provost Chowki Abdallah and said, we need more space. This is a fire hazard. And so we eventually did get more space. But we were not set up to survive. Regents thought that we would last maybe 2 to 3 years. We were seen as just a program. We were seen as a means to an end, really to get people to stop talking, right? And for people to stop advocating for a space like the LGBTQ Resource Center. But we were able to secure funding. We were able to really move into a space of not just existing and surviving, but thriving. We are now 10 years old. We have a very a little bit more spacious center, and we have plans for the next 20, 30 years. So we have proven that we can survive and we can thrive. And one of the things I really hope that as a takeaway for today is that trans and queer history at UNM, trans and queer activism at UNM did not start in 2009. We had individuals like Ben who were having these conversations and having these experiences on campus in the 1950s. This is the beginning of a larger research project that I'll be undertaking, because I am curious as to know what other stories are there. If Ben wrote his story, who else was writing stories? And I think that, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other. One of the things that we do in history, right, is we read against the grain. And so I want to do more research and finding out who are those other hidden voices and how can we honor them. And I think that it's important for us to do research like this because it gives people that hope and that knowledge that we have been here, that we are not an aberration, that we are a community that has been thriving on this campus for nearly a century now. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Yeah, we were in one room in the basement, Anya, and it was rough. Let me tell you, um, it was those first couple of years. We had stuff that was donated to us by individuals in the community. We had a refrigerator that was given to us by the biology department, and someone had told us that cadavers had been stored in it. We didn't know if that was true or not, but it was a really gross refrigerator, and I was so excited when we got a new one. Um, but we kind of just hodgepodge, you know, our our department together and grew it into what it is now. I see. What is a branch campus activity related to LGBTQ centers? Thank you so much for that, Jeannie. So actually, with the assistance of Jeannie, we were able to found a satellite office at UNM Gallup. We had a 3-year SAMHSA grant, and out of that grant, we were able to pay for a space to be at UNM Gallup, and it was dormant for a little while. It has picked back up, and it was picking back up right before COVID. And then because of COVID, there has been no activity there. But it is one of the goals of that I have to actually start revitalizing that because my goal is to actually have satellite offices at all the branch campuses. And we have worked with all the branch campuses. All branch campuses have gone through a safe zone training within the last 5 years. And one of the projects we're taking on in the fall is reaching out to all the branch campuses and retraining at all of them again. Because one of the things we have found through COVID is that Zoom training is not difficult actually, so it's making it a lot easier for us to train. So LGBTQ resource centers across the nation started being founded in the 90s. In the 90s, early 2000s, there were a few, but it was really around the 2009, 2010 is when it really did blow up. Adrian. Yeah, Adrian. Yeah, thank you. So I do actually plan on once this project is a little bit more completed and is a little bit more solid with recollections about PM Duffy, which I think is just going to open up much more doors. An individual who I'm looking to interview as well. His name is Dennis Weber, and he just retired 2 years ago, I believe, but he had worked for UNM for 30, 40 years and had been out since the 1970s. And so he has a lot of language as well. I also do plan on working with university archives on uncovering a little bit more history and finding and seeing what we can find. I am really thankful that the Daily Lobo does have all of their archives digital, so it was easy to do some of that research. Anyone else? So this is, I feel like, the first time I've ever finished early, which rarely happens. I'm so excited. Uh, I'm learning how to edit myself. Um, but I would love to publish on the queer history of UNM. There's, I think, a lot more to say. There's a lot more to uncover. And I what I appreciate, I think, the most about all of this, though, is that there has been this common narrative that queerness has not really thrived in the Southwest, right? When we think of queer history, we think of East Coast, West Coast. We think of also a very um, white, heteronormative, um, creations of queerness. And this work is showing us that that's not always the case. That there was queerness here in the Southwest. We also have heard that places like Santa Fe and Taos were queer havens in the 1920s and 1930s. And that work has not been done either. So there's a lot more work to be done on queerness in New Mexico. Thank you, Tommy. Yeah, it has been fun doing this research. It has been really fascinating to me. Um, and I feel really like the same language Ben's book was kind of my like arc that started this whole adventure. Uh, and if you get a chance, actually, I would recommend anybody reading it. You can get it at Zimmerman Library. It's an interesting read. It's really fascinating. He doesn't spend a lot of time on his life at UNM. The majority of the book is about his time in England, and is actually kind of a really wonderful love story between him and his partner. He found his partner um, in Oxford, and they were together until their death, which I think is pretty amazing. Yes, as soon as we do have that book, Jewel, we'll do a big book release party with a drag show. And thank you, Celia. Celia is a former emperor and empress of the United Courtesandias and is one of five of my queen mothers and queen fathers. So I appreciate that. And I think that in doing this research, I want to find those connections between, um, Albuquerque queer life outside of UNM and the ways that they connected with the university population. Yeah, no, you're right, Tommy. I think that there will be. That's where we're going to find a lot of that conversation. But I think the problem is finding that research, and I'm hoping that there's going to be a chance to get some of those oral histories. All right, I think that is it. That's all I have. Thank you all so much for participating, attending. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Also, if you are available, join us tonight at 7 o'clock. We are doing an amazing discussion with a UNM LGBTQ Resource Center alum, Laz Letcher. We are going to be talking about celebrating Juneteenth through a queer lens, and what it means, and looking at honoring um, Black, trans, and queer historical figures in the US. So it should be a wonderful conversation. Um, Thank you all so much. Have a great day.